16,000 feet beneath the Pacific, a remotely operated vehicle descended into a tomb that three governments had spent 55 years trying to forget. The Soviet submarine K-129 rested where she had fallen in 1968. Her hull cracked open, her secrets supposedly buried forever. But when the cameras pushed through the corroded hatch into the missile compartment, they found something that made no sense. 3 launch tubes designed to hold nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles sat empty. And according to every official record from Moscow, Washington, and Beijing, those missiles were never fired. The announcement came quietly in February 2023. A joint oceanographic expedition funded by private sources had located and documented the wreck of K-129 using autonomous underwater vehicles and artificial intelligence-assisted mapping technology. The press release mentioned nothing unusual, just another survey of a known Cold War wreck site, standard archival work for historical purposes. What the press release did not mention was the footage. The expedition deployed an ROV, rated to 5,000 meters. The vehicle descended through absolute darkness until its lights caught the unmistakable silhouette of a Gulf-class diesel-electric submarine lying broken on the seafloor. K-129 had come to rest at approximately 4,800 meters, deeper than the Titanic, in waters so remote that 55 years had passed without a single confirmed visual inspection of the complete wreck. The ROV approached the sail and maneuvered toward the forward section where the missile compartment was located. Gulf-class submarines carried 3 R-21 ballistic missiles in vertical launch tubes behind the conning tower. Each missile had a range of 1,400 kilometers and carried a nuclear warhead. The tubes were integral to the submarine's design, massive cylinders that ran from the missile deck down through multiple compartments. When the cameras entered the compartment, the first thing operators noticed was the lighting. The tubes should have been sealed, closed hatches blocking access to the missiles stored below. Instead, all 3 tubes gaped open, empty. The ROV descended into the first tube. The interior showed corrosion consistent with decades of exposure to seawater, but no debris, no missile fragments, no fuel residue. The tube was stripped clean. The second and third tubes told the same story. Whatever had occupied those launch cylinders was gone. The official Soviet narrative had always maintained that K-129 sank due to an internal accident. A battery explosion or hydrogen buildup in the battery compartment had caused catastrophic flooding. The submarine went down with all hands. No missiles were launched. The boat simply sank. A tragic accident during a routine patrol. The United States had a different story, though most of it remained classified. In 1974, the CIA mounted Project Azorian, one of the most expensive and audacious covert operations in history. Using the Hughes Glomar Explorer, a ship built specifically for the mission and disguised as a deep-sea mining vessel, the agency attempted to raise K-129 from the ocean floor. According to the declassified portions of the operation, the recovery effort partially succeeded. The submarine broke apart during the lift, and only a forward section was retrieved. The Soviets never learned what the Americans had recovered. For 55 years, that was where the story ended. 2 governments with 2 narratives and a wreck too deep for independent verification. The truth stayed buried under 3 miles of Pacific water. Until 2023, when cameras finally showed what was actually down there. And what they showed did not match either version of the official story. The empty tubes presented an immediate problem. If K-129 had simply suffered an accident and sank, the missiles should still be aboard. If the submarine had launched her weapons before going down, there should be evidence of the launch, scorching on the tube walls, damage to the hatches, debris from the ignition sequence. The ROV footage showed none of that. The tubes were empty and clean, as if the missiles had been carefully removed rather than fired or lost to an accident. The expedition team kept the findings quiet initially. They understood the implications. 3 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles, each with a yield measured in megatons, had vanished from a sunken Soviet submarine, and no government had ever acknowledged their absence. When word finally leaked to naval historians and Cold War researchers, the response was immediate. If the missiles were gone, where did they go? Who removed them? And more disturbingly, when? The CIA insisted that Project Azorian had recovered only the forward section of the submarine, which did not include the missile compartment. The Soviets had always maintained they never located the wreck at all. So, if neither superpower had retrieved the missiles, then who had? The alternative explanations were worse. Had K-129 actually launched her weapons? If so, at what target? And why had no government ever admitted it? The ROV footage could not answer those questions. It could only document what was missing, but the documentation was precise, captured in 4K resolution with AI-enhanced processing that created a millimeter-accurate digital model of the wreck. For the first time in history, researchers had forensic evidence from inside K-129. And the evidence contradicted everything both governments had said for more than half a century. The submarine had secrets, and those secrets had been waiting in the darkness since 1968, when 98 Soviet sailors took them to the bottom and never came back. K-129 was laid down in 1958 at the Komsomolsk on Amur shipyard in the Soviet Far East. She was a Project 629A submarine, NATO designation Golf II class, designed to carry ballistic missiles that could strike targets across the Pacific from positions near the Soviet coast. Her primary mission was nuclear deterrence, maintaining the strategic balance by ensuring the United States understood that even a successful first strike would not prevent retaliation. The boat was 98 meters long, displaced 2,300 tons submerged, and carried a crew of 83. Her 3 R-21 missiles gave her striking power that conventional submarines could not match. She entered service in 1960 and spent the next 8 years conducting routine patrols in the North Pacific. By 1968, K-129 was showing her age. Soviet submarines of that era were worked hard and maintained poorly. Patrol schedules were aggressive. Reactor compartments on nuclear boats leaked radiation. Diesel boats like K-129 spent long periods submerged running on battery power, which created hydrogen gas buildup that could ignite catastrophically if not properly vented. In February 1968, K-129 departed Rybachi Naval Base on the Kamchatka Peninsula for what should have been a routine 70-day combat patrol. Her mission was to take up station in the North Pacific and await orders. If war came, she would launch her missiles at targets on the American West Coast. If war did not come, she would surface every few days to recharge her batteries, communicate with headquarters, and continue waiting. On March 7th, K-129 transmitted a routine position report. Everything was normal. The boat was on station, maintaining radio silence as required. The next scheduled communication was set for March 12th. March 12th came and went, no transmission. Soviet Pacific Fleet headquarters waited. Submarines sometimes missed scheduled check-ins due to equipment failures or atmospheric conditions that disrupted radio propagation. Procedures called for patience. By March 20th, patience turned to alarm. The Pacific Fleet dispatched ships and aircraft to search the patrol area. They found nothing. No wreckage. No oil slicks. No debris. K-129 had simply vanished. What the Soviets did not know was that the United States Navy had detected something. The sound surveillance system, a network of underwater listening posts stretching across the Pacific, had picked up an acoustic signature on March 8th. A loud, abrupt sound followed by the noise of bulkheads collapsing. SOS UU. US operators classified it as a submarine breaking apart. The Americans knew approximately where K-129 had gone down. The Soviets did not. Moscow's search operation continued for months, covering thousands of square miles of ocean. They never found her. In Washington, a different kind of search was beginning. The CIA and Navy intelligence understood that a sunken Soviet ballistic missile submarine represented an intelligence windfall beyond measure. Code books, encryption systems, nuclear warhead designs, Missile guidance technology, everything the Americans needed to understand Soviet capabilities, was sitting on the ocean floor waiting to be recovered. The problem was depth. K-129 had sunk in 4,800 meters of water. No salvage technology in 1968 could operate at that depth. Raising a 3,000-ton submarine from 3 miles down was considered impossible. The CIA decided to try anyway. Project Azorian was born. The cover story was brilliant. Eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes would build a deep-sea mining ship to harvest manganese nodules from the ocean floor. The Hughes Glomar Explorer would be the world's most advanced civilian research vessel, equipped with a massive claw system capable of lifting heavy objects from extreme depths. In reality, every system on the ship was designed for a single purpose: grab K-129 and bring her to the surface. Construction took years. The ship alone cost over $300 million in 1970s money. The recovery system was an engineering marvel, a giant claw that could close around the submarine's hull and lift it through a central well in the ship's bottom, all while concealed from Soviet surveillance satellites. In July 1974, Hughes Glomar Explorer positioned herself over the wreck site and began recovery operations. The claw descended. Hydraulics engaged. The lift began. According to the declassified version of events, the operation was only partially successful. As the submarine rose through the water column, structural stress caused the hull to fracture. The aft section, including the missile compartment, broke away and fell back to the ocean floor. Only the forward section, containing the torpedo room and crew quarters, was recovered. The CIA retrieved 6 bodies and gave them a burial at sea. Codebooks and some equipment were salvaged from the forward compartment. But the missiles, the nuclear warheads, and the strategic secrets housed in the aft section were lost. That was the official story. For 50 years, that was all anyone knew. But the 2023 ROV footage raised uncomfortable questions. If the aft section had broken away during the lift and fallen back to the ocean floor, the missile compartment should still contain the missiles. The tubes should be sealed. The weapons should be there. Instead, the compartment was empty. Either the CIA had recovered far more than they admitted, or something else had happened to those missiles. Something that neither government wanted to discuss. The submarine had sunk once in 1968. But the truth about what happened to her might have sunk a second time in 1974, deliberately buried in classified vaults where it could never surface. The technology deployed in 2023 made the 1974 recovery attempt look primitive by comparison. The Hughes Glomar Explorer had operated blind, lowering its massive claw toward a target it could not see, relying on sonar pings and educated guesses to position the grab mechanism. The remotely operated vehicle that documented K-129 in 2023 carried AI-assisted imaging systems, multi-beam sonar, and high-definition cameras that could capture details invisible to human observers. The first comprehensive scan took 48 hours. The remotely operated vehicle methodically circled the wreck, building a 3-dimensional model that preserved every rivet, every fracture, every piece of debris. The AI processing systems compiled the data into a unified reconstruction accurate to within millimeters. What emerged was a submarine that had suffered catastrophic damage, but had not been torn apart by salvage operations. The hull showed clear evidence of violent internal explosions. The forward battery compartment had blown outward, scattering debris across the seabed. The control room was crushed. The crew quarters were flooded and collapsed. But the missile compartment told a different story. The structural damage there was minimal. The hatches on all 3 launch tubes were open, but the hinges showed no signs of explosive force. They had been opened, not blown open. The tubes themselves were intact. Corrosion was uniform across all surfaces, consistent with decades of seawater exposure, and showing no evidence of fire or explosive detonation. Naval architects who reviewed the scans focused on the details most people would overlook. The launch tube hatches on a Gulf-class submarine were heavy steel structures, sealed with multiple locking mechanisms. Opening them required hydraulic systems and electrical power. They could not simply fall open if the submarine flooded. Someone had opened those hatches deliberately. Either the crew did it before the submarine sank, or someone else did it afterward. The forensic team examining models, enhanced by AI, looked for evidence of missile launches. When a ballistic missile fires from a submerged submarine, the process is violent. High-pressure gas ejects the missile from the tube. The rocket motor ignites once the missile clears the water. The launch creates tremendous heat and pressure inside the tube. There should be scorching on the tube walls. There should be blast patterns on the surrounding structure. There should be debris from the ignition sequence, fragments of the missile's protective shroud, residue from the solid fuel motor. The scans showed none of that. The tubes were clean. No carbon scoring, no heat damage, no debris. The missiles had not launched. They had been removed. The expedition team analyzed the wreckage field surrounding the submarine. Debris scattered across several hundred meters of seafloor included personal effects, equipment from the crew compartments, fragments of the battery housings, and pieces of hull plating. But nothing that matched the profile of R-21 missile components. A ballistic missile is not a small object. The R-21 was 13 meters long and weighed 14 tons. If the missiles had been aboard when K-129 sank and had somehow separated from the submarine during the descent, they would leave a debris trail. If they had been destroyed in the same explosion that sank the boat, fragments would be scattered across the site. The scans documented every object larger than 10 centimeters within a 500-meter radius of the main wreck. No missile debris appeared anywhere. The team then examined the hull for evidence of external interference. If another vessel had visited the wreck before Project Azorian, there should be marks. Salvage claws leave distinctive damage patterns. Cutting tools create smooth edges. Cable abrasions scar metal in recognizable ways. The hull showed some damage consistent with the Hughes Glomar Explorer's recovery attempt. Claw marks on the forward section matched the configuration of the grab mechanism described in declassified CIA documents. But the missile compartment showed no such marks. No evidence of external salvage. No evidence of missile launches. No evidence of the missiles themselves. The AI systems processed metallurgical data from the tube interiors, looking for trace elements that might indicate what had happened. The analysis found uniform corrosion patterns consistent with prolonged seawater exposure beginning shortly after the submarine sank. That timeline was critical. It meant the tubes had been open and exposed to seawater since 1968 or very shortly thereafter. If the CIA had opened the tubes during Project Azorian in 1974, the corrosion patterns would show a 6-year difference between the hull and the tube interiors. They did not. The tubes had been empty for 55 years. The expedition team debated whether to release their findings publicly. They understood the implications. 3 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles had vanished from a Soviet submarine, and the evidence suggested they had been removed within days or weeks of the sinking. That meant someone had reached K-129 before either superpower admitted to finding her. The question was, who? And the even more disturbing question was, where those missiles were now. The official timeline of K-129's final days has always been remarkably sparse. Soviet records, declassified decades later, offer only the barest details. American intelligence files, still heavily redacted, provide fragments that raise more questions than they answer. What we know for certain is limited. K-129 departed Ribachi on February 24, 1968. Her last confirmed transmission came on March 7th. SOSUS detected what analysts classified as a submarine breakup on March 8th. The Soviets declared the boat missing on March 20th. The Americans located the wreck sometime in the summer of 1968 using a combination of SOSUS data and deep ocean acoustic analysis. But there are gaps in this timeline, gaps large enough to hide entire operations. The first gap appears immediately after the SOSUS detection on March 8th. American intelligence knew within hours that a Soviet submarine had suffered a catastrophic event. Standard procedure called for surveillance assets to be redirected to the area immediately. Soviet search operations would reveal fleet movements and search patterns. Observing those operations would provide valuable intelligence about Soviet submarine patrol routes and operational procedures. Declassified NSA documents confirmed that reconnaissance satellites were retasked to monitor the Soviet search. What those satellites photographed remains classified. The gaps in the photographic record are telling. Several days of imagery from the critical search area are missing from the archives, logged as unavailable or destroyed. Standard record retention procedures should have preserved those images. Their absence suggests someone decided they showed something that needed to remain hidden. The second gap involves the wreck location itself. The United States officially located K-129's position in August 1968 using data from the USNS Mizar, a Navy research vessel equipped with deep ocean sonar systems. The Mizar spent weeks methodically searching the suspected area until she found the wreck. But a closer examination of Navy ship movements shows something interesting. In late March 1968, less than 2 weeks after the SOSUS detection, a classified submarine rescue ship made an unscheduled diversion into the North Pacific. The USS Petrel, a vessel designed to support deep submergence rescue operations, spent 10 days operating in an area that naval historians later confirmed was within 50 miles of K-129's actual resting place. The Petrel's mission logs for that period are sealed. Her crew was debriefed under secrecy agreements that remain in force today. And when the Mizar officially found K-129 5 months later, the discovery was treated as new information. The timeline does not make sense unless you assume the Navy knew exactly where K-129 was in late March and sent the Petrel to investigate before committing to a major salvage operation. The third gap is the most troubling. It involves a detection that has never been fully explained. On March 8, 1968, the same day SOSUS recorded K-129's destruction, early warning radars in Alaska detected an anomalous track. An object had risen from the ocean at high speed and followed a ballistic trajectory before disappearing from radar coverage. The detection was brief and the radar signature was unclear. Analysts initially classified it as a possible missile test, but no corresponding launch had been detected from known Soviet test ranges. The incident was logged, investigated, and eventually dismissed as either a radar malfunction or a meteor entering the atmosphere at an unusual angle. But the timing bothered some analysts. The radar detection occurred approximately 7 hours after the SOSUS event. 7 hours was exactly the amount of time a submarine crew would need to evacuate, seal the boat, set a delayed launch sequence, and clear the area. If K-129 had launched a missile before sinking, it would explain the empty launch tube. It would also explain why both governments spent decades insisting the submarine never fired her weapons. A Soviet missile launch from international waters in the Pacific could have been aimed at only a few targets. Discussing those possibilities would raise questions that neither Moscow nor Washington wanted to answer. The fourth gap involves Chinese naval activity. In early April 1968, the People's Liberation Army Navy deployed an unusual concentration of vessels into the North Pacific. Chinese fishing trawlers, often used for intelligence collection, saturated the area where K-129 had gone down. Soviet observers noted the deployment and filed protests, but the Chinese claimed they were simply pursuing fish stocks. What Soviet intelligence apparently did not know was that the United States had been quietly sharing oceanographic data with China since 1966, as part of a developing intelligence relationship that would not become public for years. If the United States passed along the location of a sunken Soviet submarine, the Chinese would have been very interested in reaching it before Moscow's search teams arrived. Chinese deep submergence capabilities in 1968 were limited, but not non-existent. Research programs inherited from Soviet technical assistance had produced experimental underwater vehicles rated to depths exceeding 3,000 meters. Whether any of those vehicles could reach 4,800 meters is unclear. But the Chinese presence in the area during the critical weeks after K-129 sank cannot be dismissed as coincidence. The final gap is silence. Neither the Soviet Union nor the United States ever publicly acknowledged anything unusual about K-129 beyond the basic fact that she sank. When Project Azorian became public knowledge in 1975, after investigative journalists broke the story, both governments moved quickly to control the narrative. The CIA admitted attempting to raise the submarine. Moscow condemned the operation as a violation of sovereignty. And then both sides stopped talking. No official source has ever addressed the question of what happened to the missiles. The CIA insists they were never recovered. The Soviets never confirmed the missiles were aboard when the submarine sank, and the Chinese have never commented on their naval operations in the area. 55 years of silence, 3 governments with 3 different reasons to keep quiet. And on the ocean floor, 3 empty missile tubes waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The forensic evidence from K-129 supports multiple scenarios. None of them are comforting. Each carries implications that help explain why this story remained buried for so long. Theory 1 is the simplest and the most horrifying. K-129 launched her missiles before she sank. The scenario goes like this. Something catastrophic happened aboard the submarine in the early hours of March 8, 1968. A fire in the battery compartment, a reactor accident on a nearby Soviet nuclear boat that triggered a chain of events, or something more sinister, a rogue crew attempting to start a war. Whatever the trigger, the captain or someone else in the chain of command made the decision to launch. The missiles fired from their tubes. 1, 2, 3. The R-21 missiles broke the surface, ignited their motors, and climbed toward their programmed targets. The Alaskan radar detection supports this. An object rising from the ocean at high speed on a ballistic trajectory is exactly what you would expect from a submarine-launched missile. The fact that the radar signature was ambiguous makes sense. Early warning systems in 1968 were designed to detect intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from land-based silos, not sea-launched weapons from positions far out in the Pacific. If the missiles launched, the next question is obvious. Where did they go? An R-21 had a range of 1,400 kilometers. Fired from K-129's last known position, that range could reach coastal Alaska, but not the continental United States. Hawaii was well outside the range envelope. The most likely targets would have been American military installations in the Aleutians, or possibly the Soviet Far East itself, if the launch was an accident or an act of sabotage. No nuclear detonations were recorded anywhere in the North Pacific on March 8, 1968. The global network of seismic sensors and radiation monitoring stations that existed to detect nuclear tests would have caught any explosion. If the missiles reached their targets and detonated, someone would have noticed, unless the warheads failed to arm. Soviet nuclear weapons in that era had multiple safety interlocks designed to prevent accidental detonation. A missile launched without proper authorization codes might fly the full distance to target and simply fall into the ocean without exploding. This scenario explains the empty tubes. It explains the radar detection. It explains why both governments refused to discuss what happened. Admitting that a Soviet submarine had launched nuclear weapons, even if they failed to detonate, would have constituted an act of war. Washington would have been under enormous pressure to retaliate. Moscow would have been forced to either accept responsibility or deny everything and risk looking weak. So both sides agreed to bury it. The Soviets pretended the submarine had simply sunk. The Americans pretended they never detected the launch, and the truth stayed classified. Theory 2 is more conventional, but equally disturbing. The CIA recovered the missiles during Project Azorian and lied about it. The official story says the submarine broke apart during the lift and only the forward section was recovered. But what if that was a cover story designed to conceal a complete success? Raising an intact submarine from 3 miles down and hiding it from Soviet surveillance would have been nearly impossible. But the Hughes Glomar Explorer had a moon pool, a central well where the submarine could be lifted directly into the ship's interior, hidden from satellite observation. If the recovery succeeded completely, the CIA would have every reason to lie about it. Admitting they had captured the missile compartment would have revealed to the Soviets exactly how much intelligence had been compromised. Better to claim partial success, bury the truth in classified vaults, and let Moscow believe their most sensitive weapons systems were still secret. This theory has support. When the story of Project Azorian broke in 1975, some CIA personnel privately indicated the operation had been more successful than publicly acknowledged. Journalists who investigated the story found suspicious gaps in the declassified documents, and when later researchers tried to reconcile the official account with physics and engineering analysis of the lift operation, the numbers did not quite work. If the CIA recovered the missiles, they would have immediately transferred them to weapons laboratories for analysis: Soviet nuclear warhead design, guidance systems, fuel composition. Everything the Americans needed to understand and counter the threat. That intelligence would have been worth the entire cost of the operation. The problem with this theory is the corrosion evidence. If the missiles had remained sealed in their tubes until 1974, the tube interiors would show different corrosion patterns than the rest of the wreck. They do not. The evidence suggests the tubes were open and empty within weeks of the sinking, unless the CIA reached the wreck much earlier than anyone knows. Unless the March 1968 deployment of the USS Petrel was not just reconnaissance, but an actual recovery operation using deep submergence technology that officially did not exist yet. Theory 3 is the darkest possibility. Someone else reached the wreck first. In April 1968, the naval presence of China in the Pacific cannot be dismissed. Relations between the Soviet Union and China had deteriorated sharply, with border clashes and deepening hostility. Beijing had every reason to covet Soviet missile technology. A sunken submarine carrying ballistic missiles would have been an irresistible prize if the location of K-129 was quietly shared, and if Chinese deep submergence capabilities were more advanced than publicly acknowledged, a covert recovery might have been possible. That scenario explains the silence. Washington could not admit helping a rival acquire Soviet weapons. Moscow could not admit losing a ballistic missile submarine long enough for another power to reach it. And Beijing would have every incentive to conceal any breakthrough gained from such a recovery. Chinese missile development in the 1970s showed striking advances. Guidance systems improved. Warhead designs evolved. Some analysts noted similarities to Soviet technology that seemed unusually precise. If even one R-21 missile had been recovered, the intelligence value would have been immense. Reverse engineering alone could have accelerated weapons programs by years. What the forensic evidence suggests is narrower, but unsettling. The missiles did not remain in their tubes for decades. They were gone within weeks. Someone with the capability to operate nearly 3 miles down removed them. The wreck of K-129 still rests on the seafloor, her hull corroding, 98 sailors entombed inside. 3 launch tubes stand empty. The official stories never fully explained that absence. The submarine remains in darkness. The missiles are gone, and the unanswered questions endure.